And so, yeah, I'd like to now pass to Martin Rakitsky, the Managing Director and founder of PlanAdapt, who will introduce PlanAdapt to you and what we're doing and how we're doing things differently. So over to you, Martin.
Thank you, Carius. Just wanted to make sure, Carius, can you confirm that you can hear me well?
Yes.
Thank you. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks to the host organization of the Global Gobeshona conference for having us with this network session. Also, thank you to all participants who've dialed in and want to spend an hour or so on exploring a bit more on how climate justice plays a role in adaptation work, in how we build capacity to better adapt to climate change, and generally how to embed climate justice thinking in what is called climate action. I have the pleasure to present a bit on what we're working on, and even I'm more excited on how we work on it. PlanAdapt, you may have heard of PlanAdapt or not. We are rather young. We're an organization that is 2.5 years old. The ideas to form an organization roughly 4 or 5 years old, and they're truly sort of based on the experience of professionals that have worked in similar organizations in the public sector, in the research sector, in the wider sense in the development cooperation sector, to overcome a few barriers. And we believe it's not only about in an organization what you do, but also how you collaborate, how you take decisions, how do you come together, what are your core values, how do you build partnerships, what are they based on, why are you doing things, and so on. And that's exactly what we're trying to do. And as you can see here in the title of the slides that I'm walking you through in a few seconds, it is an experiment. We clearly want to overcome a few things, and this means we're going out of the comfort zone, we're trying out new things, and we're also trying to convince people that this is the way of running an organization and working in an organization in the 21st century. And I'll tell you more of what that means in a bit. Next slide, please. So why are we doing what we do, and who do we work for? We have a lot of thinkers, researchers, facilitators, advisors. Some people would call us experts as well. People that have been somehow exposed to questions of how we can best adapt. But clearly we are working for the people that struggle with the impacts of climate change and climate injustice. And that's an important point. We believe, and we have observed that over a long time, a certain part of the so-called climate community and the experts and the advisors and the researchers and so on have been looking at the issues of climate impacts also from a technological perspective. And that's pretty similar of how humankind has looked at environmental damage as well. Even before we talked about the impacts of climate change and accelerated climate change. But humankind in a lot of ways thinks we can invent technologies, we can scale them up, we can bring them to areas so that they can basically fix. Also from research it's about the people's context. It's about each and every community and the individual and the capacities that these people have to engage and to do something about countering these impacts, anticipating them, living better with them, and protecting their livelihood outcomes. And this is why we believe climate justice is an important part of it, because it's about social issues as well. And hence, we need to talk about governance, we need to talk about participation, ownership, empowerment. things that are closely related to justice. Next slide, please. And PlanAdapt is grounded on a few observations. We have seen a lot of interventions, projects, programs that focus on knowledge management, on the injection of new knowledge of how to adapt. And we've seen that coming from the people who know. Who are they? Presumably researchers, experts, many of them coming from the global north, well educated. They've published on these topics. And then there was a philosophy of knowledge into action. The knowledge needs to go from someone who has it, holds it, or believes who holds it, and needs to be transferred to the non-knowers, let's say. That hasn't worked in a lot of contexts, and there was a lack of sustainable change on the recipient end and so on. So this idea of injecting knowledge and also believing that the knowledge is the key and the centerpiece to social change and improvements in view of climate adaptation has not worked. And that's a lot of about how this was done. This is why we're thinking a lot, how can that be improved? And we talk about the last mile in that respect. We've also seen that a lot of places, and those are, let's say, people that live in probably the countries that are called least developed countries, economically less capable, also disadvantaged in the global financial systems, and in many other ways disadvantaged. They suffer most because they have the lowest capacity and the lowest ability to adapt themselves. And we found that also the knowledge doesn't go to these people where it's most needed and where it's most urgent. And the last observation is also, as I've said before, adaptation knowledge and knowledge about how to adapt best, how to cope, how to anticipate, has been kept for a long time in academic and expert circles, and we want to change that. Next one. So what are we doing? Clearly, people, action, impact is in the middle. This is what drives us every day. And we are probably working in the three areas of what we also call knowledge-based activities, where knowledge does play a role. On the left-hand side, clearly there's a part of PlanAdapt, of the PlanAdapt community that is generating knowledge, that also thinks about how can this knowledge and how can the research result be shaped. How can the generation process be shaped in a way so it immediately informs action and creates social impact? I've talked about this sort of gap between knowledge and action, but also the gap of not only how, but also who takes it to the other side. There's often sort of in adaptation a gap between the public, the role of the public sector, and the private sector. The private sector obviously drives a lot of our markets and generation of products and services and the rules behind it. So there's always an aspect of innovation. So we're clearly looking into innovation in adaptation. It is a relatively new area. The research sector on adaptation is only 10, 15 years old. And I think we've just seen the first IPCC report drawing significantly on that knowledge. And I want to believe it was the first one who've done that seriously. And overall, we want to help people to build their capacity. Next slide, please. So this is what we are doing. If you've worked in that field, we want to give you a bit more idea and also have a look at our website. This is the things we're doing. These are the activities that we're doing every day. We have people, and we try to assemble people who have skills, expertise, passion to put these things that you see here into place. So It does always have a knowledge aspect, but we immediately want to think of how can it improve the design of climate resilient infrastructure? How can social spaces benefit from the creation of that knowledge? How can communities directly, when they plan how they build their houses and bridges, and how they do agriculture and forestry and all these things, there is a knowledge part to it, and we try to work with the implementers and the doers to bring the knowledge and bring it in a digestible and easy to use way. Next slide, please. And here comes of how we are doing things differently. We have seen that in a lot of activities around adaptation, there was a deep understanding of the context was missing. Power relations, who takes decisions, who has the say, and so on, has been neglected. And we want to overcome that. Second, we strongly believe in the power of collaboration, and also in the power of creating innovation, basically finding new solutions to new problems, and finding ways of how decision making can be dealt with collectively and in a different way, maybe different from the 20th century, maybe less hierarchical, and so on. And the last one, we give a lot of thought on how we build trust, connections, how we share values and purpose, and how we develop empathy between the actors. And that drives our approaches. Next slide. So we have invented something that's called the Climate Co-Adaptation Lab. That's our approach to innovation, collaboration, and trust building. This is how we bring people together that have knowledge about adaptation, that are passionate about adaptation, and that want to work in a transdisciplinary and intercultural way. Because we also believe in the post-COVID-19 world, and Karis has already said a lot of the collaboration is also remote. Previously, we've been flying around the globe. We had this fly in, fly out approach to a lot of knowledge products, a lot of knowledge-based and research projects. And we do that by combining the earn, learn, and grow agenda, because we believe people do not only go to work because they want to earn money, but they have other ambitions. They have other reasons why they want to collaborate with others. Next slide, please. And I want to share, and I'm almost done, a few
testimonials. I seem to be facing some technical difficulties. Just start.
So as part of our Climate Co-Adaptation Lab, we have, here we go. So we have gathered individuals that have knowledge, that are passionate, and that want to collaborate globally and interculturally, and have different disciplinary backgrounds to really come up with the solutions about adaptation. And I'll give you a few seconds just to, can you go back so we can see the first one? A few statements by PlanAdapt fellows that are active in our Climate Co-Adaptation Lab, and I'll give you a few seconds to read through the statements. So to wrap that up, you are seeing the word procedures here already in my statement. And that also links to the upcoming elements of the session and sections. Next slide, please.
Sir, please stop sharing and share again. I think problem solved. Again, try it, sir, please.
Sorry, was there an issue?
No problem. Thanks for helping out. So if you have more interest in PlanAdapt and the way we work, and if you're excited to maybe join our community, contribute, learn, earn, learn, grow, collaborate, just grow as a human being and a professional in a view of with a strong concern that we all share about the future climate risks, please do feel invited to have a look at our website and get in touch. You will see on the website of how to get in touch with our coordination hub. That's all from my side. I'll like to pass it back to Karis.
Thank you, Martin. We'll just wait for Anand's screen to catch up. Thanks, Anand. Could you move to the next slide, please? Okay, perfect. Thank you. So yeah, thanks, Martin, for sharing more about PlanAdapt and how we're doing things a bit differently. So now to introduce more fully our theme, which is under the huge umbrella of climate justice, we would really like to ask you all, what do you understand the term climate justice to mean? So if you could write your answers in the chat box or raise your hand if you would like to share verbally. Although I'd ask you to keep your intervention brief so that we we stick to time, as I'm aware of time is ticking away. Thank you, seeing all the messages pop up. So feel free to keep writing your ideas, and I will keep moving through our slides so that we stick to time. So if you move to the next slide, please, Anand. So you'll all know climate justice is incredibly broad, evolving, very dynamic. For the purposes of our session, we would break down climate justice into these three strands, as the recent IPCC report also did. So distributed justice refers to the different distributions of benefits and burdens of a particular action across different members of society. Procedural justice would refer to ensuring the opportunity for fairness, transparency, inclusion, and impartiality in the decision-making around an action. And recognitional justice insists on recognizing and including those who are or may be most affected by an action. To further narrow down these three strands, we have decided to reflect particularly on procedural justice, as that comes out a lot in the work that we do and our role as a knowledge brokering organization. So we've decided to frame today's session and the discussions around procedural justice, which I would now like to introduce Anand Menon, a member of PlanAdapt's Coordination Hub, to share more about our thoughts on procedural justice and to explain a bit more about the term. So over to you, Anand.
Thank you so much, Karis. Thank you also, Martin, for the introduction of PlanAdapt. Just to give you a little more background on myself, I'm a researcher at PlanAdapt's Coordination Hub. I'm currently based in Geneva, and I've been engaged with the organization for more than a year now. Of course, most of the work that we do, as you have probably already seen, is related to climate justice in one way or another. And it has definitely been a great learning experience as well, seeing all these different pillars of justice and how they really work when projects are implemented in the real world. So again, moving on, which seems to be hard. Excuse me again. Yeah, so essentially this is the topic I shall be covering today. It's a very important strand of our work at PlanAdapt, making the case for procedural justice and how in many ways the current manner in which it is financed and supported capacity building is often procedurally unjust. I shall be providing a bit of an introduction. Martin will probably be going much further and elaborating on capacity development and um, viewing it through a procedural justice lens. To begin with, again, let me just sort of open the floor and give you a few minutes to perhaps say what you understand by the term procedural justice, either verbally or in the chat box, as indicated before. Raj, thank you so much for your responses. And yeah, they're all very valid points. And one thing that rings out as a sort of commonality amongst them is perhaps this idea of a fair allocation of resources. And especially in terms of adaptation, perhaps more importantly, it's also that all the affected parties of climate impacts are involved in a sort of equitable decision-making process. Now, this is a part I would like to begin with because I think it's a great way to sort of unpack the term procedural justice. These are adaptation research for impact principles, which have been developed by colleagues of mine for the Adaptation Research Alliance. And as one can see, there are several pillars of justice. Also, as Karis mentioned before, yeah, so there is recognitional justice, which deals more with this whole sense of how increased vulnerability and reduced capacity for those at risk, it needs to be addressed. Then, of course, there's the important one of distributive justice. And again, this is more about impact and those whose lives are at risk from climate change. There is the growing field of intergenerational justice. And again, this deals greatly with societal impact of climate change, transboundary risk to some extent. Um, and there's also epistemic justice. And this is often related to the way knowledge is produced in itself and also learning while doing and how it sort of enhances adaptation action. But as you know, for today, the primary focus is procedural justice. And again, to unpack this term a little further, let's just see what it means. Primarily, it's about ensuring that processes for decision making are fair, accountable, transparent. These are some of the principles behind it. And of course, include, in this context, we're talking about actions targeting climate change, especially adaptation. It is important to have just procedures, including access to information, meaningful participation in decision making, a lack of bias, and access to legal procedures for all. And it is important to focus on identifying those who can plan and make these decisions and those who are included in these decisions and who can really have a say in such processes. Now, I'll go further by talking a bit about the importance of procedural justice itself. To some extent, it has been recognized even on the large scale. Article 11.2 of the Paris Agreement, it explicitly states that capacity development should be country-driven, based on and responsive to national needs, and it should also foster country ownership, in particular for developing countries at all levels, be it national, subnational, or even local. And in many ways, the issue has become so much more important in recent years, given the recognition also amongst academic circles that very often climate change is dealt with as a field of technical enterprise, where a lot of focus is on large-scale climatic models and also aggregated statistics, pardon me, whereas due to such things, issues of climate justice have been marginalized, and often this is reflected in various forms of injustice in terms of procedures. Now, questions which often arise in this context are who decides upon the needs, who decides what sort of financing mechanisms are in play, and who decides on the outcomes and so on. As we all know, there are often flaws in the current system, and perhaps I shall now pass it on to Martin to further elaborate on this and also talk on some of the ways of overcoming some of these gaps and barriers to procedural justice. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Anand, for paving what is coming here. So what I'll be sharing with you is a few more observations. It's not so much a very details of cases of procedural injustice in the climate sphere or in the sphere of capacity development for climate action, but it is focused on, and that's very, we found that a very valuable and very exciting process of people who've been following that space for the last 15, 20, 30 years, who've been exposed to many programs, many projects. You'll see a couple of statements and quotes as well that I'll share with you. And this is a paper that you also find on the PlanAdapt website. So you will find more detail there. But let me first lay out development, capacity development, also under the framing of the UNFCCC, has certain starting points and is related to quite a bit of unsatisfaction of how things have been until now. Next slide, please. So the starting point of our work was, well, there was capacity development, capacity building programs in millions and tens and hundreds of millions being spent on strengthening capacities to deal with the impacts of climate change, climate risks, in a more general perspective, building resilience as well. And we've been also trying to start from these observations on, were those measures supported in an effective way? What about the ownership of these processes? And have power relations between actors been considered? Who was in the driving seat? And then obviously also forward-looking, asking these experts and researchers on what they think should be done. Next slide, please. So when we talk about the collaboration between countries, also on the climate negotiation framework, and Anand also related to the transparency framework, to different ways of how the ones that have more resources at hand and have maybe been advantaged through certain systems, of how they interact with the ones that have been disadvantaged, and maybe expect also their support in view of developing capacities, important capacities to deal with climate change. So the first one is the exchange of money, financial transfers, financial cooperation, relatively straightforward. As you can imagine, banks, accounts, help, what you have to agree on is the amount of money. The actual process of transferring it is pretty straightforward, as we all know, given that we have a global banking system and other financial mechanisms. Next one. The second way of how we look at climate change and how we want to progress is clearly the role of how to build infrastructure differently, what kind of technologies are needed to both to adapt and mitigate climate change. And here as well is basically a transfer. Someone has to pay for it, but someone also has to bring the technology. Not every country, we know that we have somehow a world trade system where we rely on different specialities. Some countries are more specialized in certain technologies, have higher capabilities. The industries are more geared towards innovation and also the production and the mass production of certain technologies. But however, we know that is someone funds, the technology obviously has to be there, and then there is a process of scaling up and transferring it to the areas where the technology has not been applied yet. And yes, there is an adoption process that one needs to go through that's somehow not simple, but still this kind of cooperation is somehow straightforward. Next slide, please. But the hardest part of international cooperation is how can we build the capacities? And that means endogenous capacities we talked about previously, maybe the capacities where they're most needed are not there. It's a matter of knowledge, but that's also a lot to do with other aspects of social development, of human development that is related to the term capacity. Some people have coined that for a long time, as I said previously, knowledge transfer or even technical assistance. There's a question mark here because that's again picking up that argument that Anand highlighted. It is believed there's technical knowledge needed, and then you're fine on the other side, then your capacity can improve. And someone has to come to bring that or to deliver this. But in reality, as we all know, capacity is something that is built over years, over decades. It's happening at the individual level. It's happening at system level or at the level of an organization, an institution. It's a very fine-grained and complex process of how the overall capacity of an institution can be considered as being enhanced. And hence, next click, please. This kind of transfer and this kind of cooperation is much more difficult. Yes, we know what we want to get out of it, but what we have to do in order to get there is much more debated. And here we want to talk about the procedures of this chaotic, some people call it a spaghetti junction, because you don't know, you know where to enter the junction, but you don't know where you get out. Next slide, please. So just to skip that part on what is, you probably have heard capacity building, capacity development as terms, and there's many sort of sub issues of it. There's certain the learning aspect, there's the collaboration aspect, there's the part of partnerships, and how we can do things collectively, not at an individual level. Training, you have heard, as a typical method of injecting something, and then on the other end of the intervention on the measure, you have improved capacity. But is it really improved? So here you find a bit the word cloud of, we didn't go into these definitional questions, but this is that's the activities and the process that we talk about when we summarize as capacity development. Next slide, please. So now we're getting closer to this issue of procedural justice. And we have heard and also seen in your comments, it's a lot about the how. And the how is often inbuilt of how things are implemented. How is the work organized? Who is part of the work? And the so-called, and this is the gray space here, the capacity development project or intervention. Unfortunately, it's been more treated over the last 20, 30, 40 years as an intervention. And that means already sort of, it's squeezed into this management unit called project. a project needs to start, someone has to fund the project, we need people who manage the project, we need to decide on what kind of activities and so on. All procedural aspects of designing, planning, implementing, and resourcing a project. And let's look at the three key actors here. Clearly, there is a so-called recipient or the participant of the capacity development intervention project measure in the blue space, often also called beneficiary. And on the right-hand side, there's someone who pays for the process. Whatever process, and you remember the activities that we looked at before, someone needs to pay for it. That can be a national government, that can be domestic funds, or sometimes in the international cooperation scene, also foreign funds or international funds. And then in the middle, you see, relying on this belief that this transfer needs an injection, similar to what we talked about. Money is changing hands or technology is changing hands. Here we have the belief it needs an external sort of facilitator in the best case. Sometimes it's also a trainer or a training facilitator or a lecturer or a researcher who injects, almost as from a medical perspective, injects knowledge and maybe other things, and the outcome is improved capacity. Next slide, please. Across the literature and also the experts that we talk to, there is a clear debate to what extent is this external actor needed. Maybe sometimes it's not even needed, but it's clearly its decision, and a lot of projects and intervention coined capacity development for climate action still rely on these actors. There's another whole school where there is a more recognition of the fact that the recipients or the participants, the people in the blue box here, that they can even get organized themselves, and there is an endogenous way of building capacity. It doesn't need that external injection. But both models exist in hybrids of those. Next one. As Anand has already mentioned, what are the key questions around procedural justice here? Again, it's about who decides on the activities, how the project is set up, what kind of activities should be funded, what are the very methods, what are the learning methods, what are the pedagogical methods, who is needed, how long is the process does require in order to come out with a measurable impact called capacity. Who's invited into the process? Who's allowed to participate and benefit? Who decides on how success is measured? We've heard many times that it's often the number of trainings and the number of training participants. You have a nice report, you take a couple of photos of lecture-like one-way kind of injections of knowledge, or at least transmission and emission of knowledge. It doesn't mean that it's been absorbed on the other hand. You can still take a picture of the classroom or a similar kind of setups, and you have something that makes the funder happy. It's also the last point, as I said before, there is a decision to be taken. To what extent does it need these external experts, these researchers, these foreign consultants that come and inject and input the knowledge, and who is the exact provider? And now I want to remind you the arenas and where these procedures sit. Next click, please. So here we talk about procedures, and this is procurement. It is about how the funders procure, for instance, if you look at the last bullet point, procure the support by the consultants, by the people that facilitate the process as well. And also, we all know that governments procure these services as well. Next one. It is the arena of who approves and who signs off. It's again power about the and as part of the decision-making process. And next one. And it's how these how projects as a management unit, how they're managed. Are they open to changes? Do they listen to various? Can I ask you to switch off your? I'm almost done. So those are the arenas where the procedure, important procedure, is not the only one. Next slide. But this are the ones that I wanted to highlight. So the way how things are at the moment, some of these procedures, a considerable amount of people think they're unjust. And I'll let you read the short statements by people who have been following this kind of processes that I've described over the last 20 and 30 years. And you can see of where the issues arise. Reading through these statements, it becomes clear that there is issues and they have some relationship to procedural injustice, often overlooked. On the left-hand side here, for instance, this has been a consultant who has been flying around the world, and the company that he represents as an important research institute and consulting company who have done hundreds and hundreds of capacity building workshops. And you can also see here the motivation of going even an inch beyond what is described in the terms of reference, which is a result of decision-making in the procurement arena, is very, there is no incentive to go when we talked about PlanAdapt before, to walk that last mile, because you basically lose time and money, therefore. Hence, the procedure in itself has a strong bearing vis-a-vis the outcome, or on what comes out of the process later on, because the people are encouraged to do good enough. And that's a result of the procedure around the approval and the writing and the requirements in the terms of reference. I want to leave it at that. You see that we are dealing with it on a regular basis. I hope that sparked a bit of interest. Please have a look at the report. There's more examples and more insights. I think Karis shared that, and thank you very much for listening. Back to you, Karis.
Thank you, Martin. Thanks for sharing, and thank you, Anand, as well. So after all of that, you may be thinking, I've heard this all before. Haven't we all agreed on the importance of procedural justice in all manners of all walks of life, but particularly in climate change, adaptation, and development? So yeah, we're not trying to reinvent the wheel. For us, our concern is that given that there is this consensus on the importance of procedural justice, why is it still so difficult to put what we know and for many of us what we believe into practice? So I ask you to keep this in mind as we move to the discussions and breakout groups. So next slide, please. So yes, we will be moving to breakout groups. The facilitators will be myself and Nicole Rowland, who is a member of PlanAdapt's Coordination Hub as well. Next slide, please. So there will be 2 breakout groups. We were thinking 30 minutes, but I think because of time, we'll stick with 20 minutes. So these are the guiding questions. So very open. What do you understand to be the barriers to procedural justice? And how do we overcome the barriers to procedural justice? We will be using the virtual whiteboard tool Mural, which hopefully you will be familiar with. I will share the links in just a second. This is to collect notes and capture ideas as we discuss the various themes and questions that have arisen throughout this session. And I would invite you to assign yourself to a breakout room, which you should be able to do through Zoom. And yeah, your facilitator will introduce and guide the process, and keep us all to time as well. So let me just share the links to Mural. Or actually, maybe it's better if I share the links when you're in your breakout group, because there are 2 Mural boards. I think that would be better. Oh, and my connection is unstable. Okay, so if you would like to assign yourself to a breakout group, that would be great.
Absolutely. Sorry, I'm just waiting for the presentation to load up again.
No worries, thank you. So we will have time for maybe 1 or 2 questions if anybody has any questions or comments that they would like to ask or briefly say at the end of our session. Or you can add that to the chat box or raise your hand, as we are quite a small group. Thank you, Anand. Are there any questions or comments from any participants?
I would have a question for other participants.
Go for it.
And then maybe also following up on what you said, Madia, and also in our breakout rooms. To what extent do you think culture and cultural framings of how decisions are being made in a society and in a culture over decades, maybe centuries, like to what extent is it possible to come and to introduce concepts that are fairly foreign, that are fairly different, more democratic, or try to promote principles of decision making, of equity that are fairly different from what people are used to, and so on. How do you see the level of implementability and the chance of overcoming resistance, or also maybe one should be cautious to not introduce concepts that are too different from the current state of the art, maybe a slight sort of deviation, but not completely revolutionary and radical? What do you think about this? Also what some people have called radical collaboration, radical participation, so just coming with concepts and principles that are not necessarily embedded in what people are used to, and certainly not the social norms and things like that. Very happy to hear from you, Madia, or others who have a thought on this.
If you also have, you're unmuted. Cool. Go for it.
I feel like I can only speak for my country, given my experience level or what my knowledge level is. And I feel like obviously there is a good amount of resistance, because the most vulnerable people that we're talking about, when we're talking about equity, it's obviously the most vulnerable people. The most vulnerable people turn out to be the low income people. So these categories of people, they are more resistant to radical changes, and it needs to come like in a way that they can understand, they can perceive. You need to give them ample amount of time to be able to accept it. And also not completely, because of course in our context, culture plays a huge part, and I believe that it must be the case everywhere else. They have their own culture. If you deviate them too much from that, and you might have a great idea, it might have great outcomes, but if it's not feasible for them, or they're not ready to accept it, and my receiving end does not have an open mind for it, it's basically almost, if I say in a harsh way, useless. So of course culture, I feel like, is a part of it, and implementing or going out of context, because whenever we develop anything, I think it's important that the first thing is that my spatial context varies. So make an analysis of the context that you're working in and adjust it according to context. So yeah, that's my perception on it. Thank you.
Just to quickly react on it, I'm sitting in a lot of conferences, high-level discussions with people, and people think transformation, quick, big change, very fundamental change, transformational change. I'm sure you will have heard that. Is that different to what you've just said, Madiha? Because from what I'm understanding also, thanks Nicole and Saqib, we need to go step by step. We can't overwhelm people. What do you think about this this very strong push for transformational change and fundamental change in relation to what we just said?
I think that's more of a context-based thing. Context in the sense of what are we exactly working on. I mean, transformational change would be a very broad topic. Again, it would mean what is my topic and how much of transformation. Like recently we were working on just urban transition. That's an aspect, but what we faced when we went for a kickoff meeting in the field where we are working is that when you take such a complicated term, which is a very new concept, and again, could be categorized as something transformational, the local people don't really get it. It's almost similar to like how 15 years back, climate change was a concept that people were not ready to accept because it was very difficult to explain to them because back then it was new. So I think that's what happens. But then now it's like everyone understands climate change, even the my lower educated people, less educated people, they understand. So I feel like with transformational changes, that's the problem. That if you can't make the people understand, but if you can, I mean, so you might end up overwhelming them, and that's where it's a very fine line that needs to be properly drawn. It's from my end what I think.
Thanks, Madiha. That was great. Great intervention. Saqib, would you like to add anything to this conversation?
Thank you. I think just sort of building on that, one point building on from what Madiha was saying about jumping into sort of climate change projects, which might not have been really a factor in Bangladesh for many years, focusing primarily only on development issues. I think quite a lot of what we've learned from that experience is that a lot of development partners will jump immediately into implementation without really considering capacity development from the beginning. And I think that in terms of addressing transformative approaches, if we address the capacity that is needed for the transformative approaches that we're working on, building up the capacity within communities, within local governments, within NGO sectors, often undercapacitated within developing countries. I think focusing on capacity development from the beginning also gives us a little bit of a foundation to be a bit more transformative rather than incremental. Because it's not just about the project that you're implementing as a development partner, whether you're World Bank or GCF or any of the other sort of bigger institutions. It's not just the program that you're doing. Developing that capacity allows these stakeholders to foster that work, use that foundation, and bring in more support. And it's about building that sort of landscape and ecosystem of other stakeholders that are understanding your issues, being able to use the strengths that you've developed, the capacities you've developed, bringing in further project to assess them in this work, and using the lessons that you've built in, whether they be for capacity building in climate change or climate justice or any other development issues, stakeholder analysis, etc. All these activities are some things that if you are able to address and capacitate the local stakeholders properly, they will be using it in different contexts, whether you're there or not from an outside organization. So capacity development, I think, in terms of transformative approaches, should be something that we address at the beginning rather than as a sort of reviewed in a 2-3 year program. Thank you.
No, thanks for that. That was, yeah, completely agree with everything you said. Would anybody else like to contribute? I'm aware that we are slightly over time, but this is an interesting conversation. If anybody would like to say anything, please raise your hand or feel free to unmute yourself, as we are still quite a small group. And if not, if you could move to the next slide, please, Anand. So yeah, if you would like to share anything, your key takeaway from this session, please feel free to share in the chat box. And you can move to the final slide. Thank you. So thank you so much for listening and participating in our session. We really hope that we've provoked some thoughts, kind of reignited this discussion on procedural justice. It's still ongoing. There's still a lot more work to do. We may all agree on procedural justice, but yeah, we need to work on how we implement it, how it works in practice. So I'd like to say a big thank you to the PlanAdapt team for contributing and organizing this session. And of course, thanks to ICAD and the whole team for supporting us. The conference has been great so far.